It's 10 times the terror.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
Okay.
Hello, this is Paul, and welcome to 10 Times the Terror. We're continuing with a kind of series we've had. I've talked about the Universal horror film classics in that very rich 5-year period of 1931 to 36. We did do a program on Basil Rathbone, and we've also done, in terms of Sherlock Holmes, we've also done a program on the Hound of the Baskervilles, at least focusing on the Hammer 1959 version. What I want to talk about today, though, is the Universal Sherlock Holmes series that was done from 1942 through 1946. And I'm going to argue that this was the best dramatization series of Sherlock Holmes. I'm talking here about an American interpretation, but there are several reasons why I think this was the preeminent Sherlock Holmes series. It has its drawbacks. It has things that seem outdated today, but all in all, it is in my estimation, I'll explain why, the basic Sherlock Holmes portrayal that endures up to the present, which is now well over 100 years, going back to the beginning of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Well, to set the context of this, why do I think that a 12-film series, plus I would also put in there the 2 films that were made at 20th Century Fox, The Hound of the Baskervilles, which really is the film that introduces a whole new approach to the Holmes stories, and then The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, made also the same year, also by 20th Century Fox, and set in the Victorian period. So those are 2 very, very strong films. And there are many, many Holmes dramatizations that are excellent, many on television, film. I'm talking here, though, about the basic view of Holmes that emerges in the early 20th century, and which is supplanted for all time by the Basil Rathbone Universal series. So let me explain what I'm talking about with that. Sherlock Holmes is a composite figure. His creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, in effect, lost control of the character early on and resented how much pressure was being put on him to continue writing Holmes stories when he was interested in writing historical novels, also political pieces. He wrote a history of the Boer War. He did multiple accomplishments, and he got so tired with the character that, as is well known, he supposedly killed him off in a fight with Professor Moriarty at the brink of the Reykjavik Falls in Switzerland. And in a story entitled The Final Problem, Watson is lured away from Holmes in this setting, comes back, and based on what he sees, he assumes that Holmes and Moriarty have both fallen to their death at the center of the Reykjavik Falls. Well, fortunately, no bodies were ever recovered from this. So for the time being, though, Doyle thought he was done with Holmes. He could not have been more wrong. And Holmes, again, had taken off on a life of his own. The first real dramatic embodiment of Sherlock Holmes was an American actor, William Gillette, who wrote his own screenplay. Again, it wasn't a screenplay, he wrote his own play. That was hugely popular. And his portrayal of Holmes was definitive for 40 years, from 1899 until 1939, when Basil Rathbone made his first appearance in The Hound of the Baskervilles. The critical thing here is that Gillette wanted to have free hand to develop the character as he saw it. And he got Doyle's support in putting together his play. But Doyle really, at this point, as far as Doyle was concerned, he thought he was done with Sherlock Holmes. Well, just like Professor Moriarty and a host of other villains, to think you're done with Sherlock Holmes is an illusion. The master detective will always emerge triumphant. But not to get too carried away there with it. So William Gillette, anyway, is working on a theatrical version of Sherlock Holmes. And in doing so, he's not adapting any of the particular stories. And at this point, there had been 2 novels and 2 short story collections that had been published in various magazines, especially the Strand magazine. And this was the basis of the Sherlock Holmes fandom, if you will, the Sherlock Holmes following. Well, Gillette sent a famous telegram to Arthur Conan Doyle where he said, "May I marry Holmes?" And Doyle equally famously wrote back, "You may marry or murder or do whatever you want with him." Doyle considered himself done with Holmes. Well, William Gillette faced the question of how do you bring Sherlock Holmes to the stage? And then ultimately, very soon thereafter, to movies, because the play that Gillette wrote and starred in was filmed in 1916 and has recently become available, actually in a pretty good print. And different aspects of the Holmes persona was already emerging. The whole thing about the deerstalker hat that we associate with Holmes really came about through the illustrations done by Sidney Paget. But Gillette introduced something that was of a purely theatrical nature that has stayed all the way through, which is that Holmes smoked a curved pipe. Now, Doyle never mentions the curved pipe in the stories, and nor are they ever shown in the illustrations. But the idea of the curved pipe came from William Gillette, the actor, who was playing Holmes as well as having written the play, with the idea that you could speak your lines holding a curved pipe in your mouth in a way you couldn't with a straight pipe. So forever after, and also a meerschaum pipe, which was light and very visible. These accoutrements really came with Gillette. But the big thing with Gillette is he made a decision in terms of how to dramatize the Holmes stories. He made several decisions. First one was he wasn't going to use any existing plots that Doyle had written. He was going to make up his own plot. However, in so doing, he was going to add elements from the stories without following the storylines themselves. So, for example, he has Professor Moriarty being caught in Holmes's Baker Street rooms, pretending to be a cabman, and Holmes sees through the disguise, of course, and puts handcuffs on him as he's trying to pick up the luggage. Well, that's the climax of A Study in Scarlet. It has nothing to do with Professor Moriarty. But Gillette has, and what he did throughout the whole play was he would take snippets, little bits and pieces of the stories, but he had a whole different kind of narrative. And his narrative had to do with a very important woman who is now lost to history, one of the great mysteries of all time, Alice Faulkner. The average person today has never heard of Alice Faulkner. She is the damsel in distress that Holmes comes to rescue, that she's being kidnapped and blackmailed, and Holmes rescues her, and in so doing gets into some very physical dimensions of things. Famous scene where he picks up a chair and smashes the light on a table to kind of help rescue Alice. What Gillette decided was to minimize the character of Dr. Watson. Why? Well, in the stories, Watson is the narrator. That's in, and again, we're talking about there were 2 novels and about 22 stories that had already, 20 some stories that had been published. But in a play, or by extension a movie, you don't need a narrator. So Watson's role was greatly diminished. And in place of Watson, though, you had this love interest, Alice Faulkner, and at the end of Gillette's play, he's holding her in his arms, and a wedding is imminent. So this is a very different kind of Sherlock Holmes than what people today are familiar with or can know about. Now, there's several other interesting things here, several mysteries to be cleared up, if you will. What happens to Alice Faulkner, and how does Watson regain his standing, which we would like to see in the stories, of being a major character? But in the Gillette play, Watson is way down the cast list. He's just not that important a person. Ironically, in the original play version in London in 1899, there's a page boy named Billy who shows up in one of the 20th Century Fox Rathbone films and then disappears forever. But he was originally played by Charlie Chaplin, a young Charlie Chaplin, which is interesting. Okay, the other thing that we note here is that the second Rathbone film, called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, features a number of critical development in the course of what happens here. Alice Faulkner totally disappears. However, in the opening of the film, in the credits, it says that the screenplay is based on the Gillette play. Well, critics have come and noted, they said, well, if you really look at the film and you read the play, or ever seen the play was revived on Broadway in the 1970s and also on the West End in London. So the play doesn't totally disappear from the picture here. But when one looks at the film, you say this is really nothing like Gillette's play, even though it mentions his name in the credits. Well, what has to be seen here, though, is in 1932, Fox Studios, before they merged with 20th Century Studios to become 20th Century Fox, Fox Studios had gotten the rights to the film, to the play rather, the Gillette's play. And that play had been very successful as a silent film. The notable version was with John Barrymore, who was the leading male actor of his time, as well as the Gillette play being revived again and again and again through tremendous popularity. And Gillette was playing the role well up into his 60s. But what we see, though, is the 1932 film that was done at Fox had kind of an extensive name. And they called it, the whole title was Conan Doyle's Master Detective Sherlock Holmes, but shortened to be Sherlock Holmes. Clive Brooke, again, an actor not many people are familiar with today, but an imposing British actor, played Holmes. But again, Watson is very much of a minor character, but Alice Faulkner is very front and center. What the Sherlock Holmes 1932 film really is a sequel to the Gillette play. And at the end of the Gillette play, Moriarty is not falling to his death in the Reykjavik Falls, but he's being arrested and to be taken to prison. Well, the Sherlock Holmes 1932 film opens with Moriarty escaping from prison and plotting his revenge. Reginald Owen, who becomes well known a few years later as Scrooge in the MGM version of A Christmas Carol, 1938, plays Watson, who's like fifth billing. Again, very reduced to a minor character. Alice Faulkner is a much more important character, as is Billy the Page Boy. And in what is a pretty exciting film, Moriarty manages to kidnap not only Alice, but Billy, and he's setting up a plan, which is kind of the plot outline of the Red-Headed League, where he's brought in American gangsters to kind of create disturbances in London while he's planning to rob a major bank. And the one action of the gangsters is really a cover-up for what he's planning to do with robbing the bank, but also rescuing Alice and Billy. And then there are scenes earlier with Alice talking to her parents and not sure about she should marry a detective. Things that sound very foreign to Sherlock Holmes fans of the present or of the past 60, 70 years, for that matter. But what happens then, and now it's interesting that the screenplay for the 1932 Sherlock Holmes film is by a writer named Bertram Milhauser, who later on would write many of the screenplays for the Universal series. The question, though, that we have that nobody can easily answer, at least at this late date in history, is what happens from his screenplay of 1932, where Holmes is clearly in love with Alice Faulkner and they're planning their wedding, and the film ends on that note. 10 years later, when he's writing the Universal series, she's nowhere to be found. And in fact, for that matter, in the Universal series, Billy the Page Boy becomes an anachronism, and he's dropped out. But the main idea of the Gillette approach to the stories is kept. And Milhauser kind of understood this, that he would do like William Gillette. He would take elements of the stories and use them in an original plot. So there was some, and a couple of times did loose adaptations of the stories. The film Sherlock Holmes Faces Death is a loose adaptation of the Musgrave Ritual. In other cases, like Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, which supposedly is based in some way on the Dancing Men, all that's kept of the Dancing Men story is simply the code, that there's a code that has to be deciphered. Otherwise, it has nothing to do with the rest of that. Milhauser is an interesting guy in a lot of ways. So first of all, what happens from 1932 to, if you will, 1939, where Alice Faulkner disappears forever? And the only times that she's ever shown up again is when the Gillette play has been revived. And it has been revived periodically. But, in fact, Basil Rathbone was once approached about doing the play, and he declined, simply saying that thought the play was out of date, that it was just not something for modern audiences. Well, he was wrong, because in the 1970s, it was a huge hit on Broadway. But outside of that, there is no mention of this Alice Faulkner. Now, the other thing that comes in here that changes the nature of the Holmes saga on, again, as a performance in a dramatic form, has to do, of course, with the character of Watson. In the Basil Rathbone Hound of the Baskervilles, not only is Rathbone's second build, which is sort of a surprise after Richard Green, who plays Sir Henry Baskerville, although arguably he has more screen time than Rathbone does, because in the story, Holmes disappears for a long stretch. But in that version, Nigel Bruce, who plays Watson, is fourth build. Okay, and that was pretty typical for the first 40 years of dramatizations of Sherlock Holmes. In fact, the very first version of The Hound of the Baskervilles, which was done in Germany, very loose adaptation, it hardly has Watson in it at all, which is really surprising, because Watson figures in an important way in that story. But you get the idea there that, again, film audiences weren't interested in the character of Watson that much, and everything depended on Holmes, who was becoming more and more of an action figure than just a cerebral detective solving crimes and deciphering problems, codes, or whatever else. Well, here's a critical point about how Watson changed, why I would argue that the Basil Rathbone Nigel Bruce series is the best dramatization of Sherlock Holmes, bar none. Many others that are very good. You can talk about Peter Cushing, Jeremy Brett, Benedict Cumberbatch, and other portrayals of Watson. We'll get to those in a minute. But Nigel Bruce rescues the character of Watson from being a secondary figure. How does this happen? Nigel Bruce has comic business. At one point, he pretends to be even Sherlock Holmes in a kind of a comic exchange with the actual Holmes in disguise. And some people at the time, and some critics since then, have said, oh, well, this is not the Watson we know of the story. He's too much of a buffoon. Well, that's overstated, first of all, because there are critical times where Watson saves Holmes' life, when Holmes, many times rather foolishly, gets himself in danger. And secondly, Watson plays an important medical role. He can tell, in a case of a back-breaking killer, which particular vertebrae was broken. His medical expertise becomes very important at times. But the source of this really goes back to Conan Doyle himself. In 1910, now at this point, jump ahead of this, we did talk about how Doyle in the early 1900s meets a friend when he's serving as a medical doctor in the Boer War, who tells him about his about Devonshire and Dartmoor in England, and all of these strange legends of the place. It's very fog-bound moors and so forth. And Doyle's imagination gets fired with the story of this demonic hellhound that haunts a family. Well, that becomes the basis for the Hound of the Baskervilles. And I think, as I mentioned before, when Doyle's beginning to put the story together, he said, well, he needs to have a hero. He needs to have someone who stands up against the Hound. And so, but he says to himself, why should I invent such a hero? I've already got one in Sherlock Holmes. So even though Holmes is, quote, officially dead, he comes back in the Hound of the Baskervilles, which supplants all previous stories that Doyle had done. So Doyle was in many ways a poor judge of his own work, but that's another discussion, really. Soon after that, Doyle gets given an offer he can't refuse to bring Holmes literally back from the dead, and he's able to do so because no body was ever recovered from the Reichenbach Falls, and Holmes has this very imaginative reason of how he escaped from the falls, and for that matter, Professor Moriarty comes back later in the cycle of the story. So things get repeated again and again. All right, but Doyle makes an important decision in the year 1910. He realizes how much money can be made from Holmes' dramatizations. He's seeing the success of the Gillette play. So he decides to do his own play, and he bases it on one of the most popular stories, The Speckled Band. Now, in doing this, he again has to figure out what role is he going to give to Watson. Well, he works Watson into having a relationship with the family where these strange deaths in the night occur. But the critical thing is Doyle gives Watson comic business. Doyle himself introduces the idea of Watson as a comic relief. So it takes a while for that to filter through. But when we come to Nigel Bruce, he's really carrying out Doyle's conception, not of the literary Watson, but of the dramatic Watson. And this creates then a whole new dynamic between Holmes and Watson. And you kind of repartee back and forth. And yeah, it gets overdone, to be sure, in some of the later films. But it works. I mean, you really do get a sense of the relationship between Holmes and Watson. And this idea of Watson having comic business shows up in, I think, one of the best Watsons in film history is the film Murder by Decree, directed by Bob Clark, with Christopher Plummer as Holmes and James Mason as Watson. And there's a great scene where Watson is eating his dinner and he's trying to pick up the peas on his fork and they keep falling off. And Holmes just comes over and looks and takes a fork and just squashes the peas and say, that's how you do it. And Watson is really kind of resenting that. He says, you can't go and crush a man's peas. Well, it's a great little comic interlude, but it picks up on this idea of Watson being a comic relief. Now, that's not true in a lot of other versions where, but Watson is restored as a major character in the Universal Rathbone films. That's the key point to be made. When The Hound of the Baskervilles was filmed, there was a real concern about horror films at that point in Hollywood. And basically, after 1936, as of 1936, no new horror films were scheduled because there'd been a lot of outcry about them. That goes back to the original Universal series. But when they did the 20th Century Fox, the horror themes are played down, romance is elevated, the love interest between Sir Henry and Beryl Stapleton is very different from what it is in the books and other treatments. But those are all ways to hedge the bets. What the people at 20th Century Fox did not realize at the time was the fact that Universal was going to come out with a sequel called Son of Frankenstein, starring, interestingly enough, Basil Rathbone as the titular son, and that the horror film would be reborn in kind of a silver age. But what's interesting, too, with the Universal series is it picks up on themes and suggestions that are in the stories. Again, it only does this in a kind of generalized kind of way. Bertram Milhauser, interestingly enough, borrows from one of his own screenplays of a Philo Vance mystery. Now, Philo Vance is a name that's virtually unknown today, but he was in the 1920s and 30s a major detective. And in fact, Basil Rathbone plays him. I think I mentioned this in an earlier podcast. He actually plays him in a 1930 film called The Bishop Murder Case, where at one point, Rathbone as Philo Vance, along with the district attorney, are referred to by another character as, quote, Holmes and Watson. When you look at that old film, The Bishop Murder Case, it's staggering to think it took Hollywood 9 years to cast Basil Rathbone as Holmes because he's so authoritative in the role. Well, getting back here, Roger Milhauser, in a screenplay called The Garden Murder Case, has a scene where a hypnotist supposedly hypnotizes Philo Vance and makes him walk out onto a ledge, tempting him to fall off. Well, Milhauser lifts that up full and completely and uses it in a film called The Woman in Green, where Holmes is pretending to be hypnotized. He's not really trying to be hypnotized. He's walking along a ledge. Now, in the Universal series, what's interesting about it is it begins in the dark days of World War II, 1942. There's no way you could have made a movie about English life in 1942 and not deal with the war. I mean, this was a huge, big factor. Well, fortunately, Conan Doyle had written a war story about Holmes in World War I called His Last Bow, again, trying to end the Holmes cycle, which never quite really ended. But the first several Holmes films that Universal did, they began with this adaptation and a more expanded version, again, of His Last Bow. But it's this idea of a German spy infiltrating the upper echelons of the British intelligence. The first three films, which were The Voice of Terror, Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, and then Sherlock Holmes in Washington, all very much picked up on these World War II themes. And people kind of say, well, that's not really Holmes. Well, the fact is, most Holmes films up to that point had been filmed not in a Victorian setting like the original novels. They'd been filmed in the time period in which they were produced. So as far back as the silent era, as far back as John Barrymore and in England, Ely Norwood, they've got telephones and they're riding around in cars and so forth that are much more the 1920s than they are the 1890s. So that was already taking place. But here's a big step. Universal at this point was cranking out all kinds of horror films and building a miniseries about not only Frankenstein and Dracula, but the Wolfman and the Mummy, and even some more minor characters along the way. And Milhauser came up with this idea that not only should we adapt the Holmes stories to a different setting a little bit, even though retaining some of the basic elements, but we can go into the whole thing about the horror films, so that the Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, Mummy pictures that we're playing and were being churned out on an annual basis actually gave way to using Sherlock Holmes in a horror film setting. This was enormously effective. Now, to be sure, you can't call the Holmes stories horror stories. And Tom Weaver and his co-authors, those include all of the Sherlock Holmes series in their discussion of all the Universal horror films going back to the silent era with Lon Chaney and the Phantom of the Opera on up to the end of the cycle, She-Wolf of London, some other very forgettable films. But Milhauser comes up with the idea of would be like a horror figure for Holmes. He's not going to face the Wolfman or the Mummy, but he comes up with, get this, the Spider Woman, played by Gail Sondergaard, Academy Award winner. And that is really putting Holmes into a context of elements of horror, people who are driven to suicide by. And you have this very notable scene of a deadly spider crawling down a wall, coming through a ventilator, and Holmes is setting a trap with that. But you get this tarantula that is framed with long shadows and everything, very effective. Unfortunately, Milhauser is an example of a screenwriter who paints himself into a corner. In the climax of The Spider Woman, he's got Holmes tied up in a shooting gallery, and Watson outside, totally unaware that Holmes is in the shooting gallery, and Watson is going to be shooting, and somehow every time, and this is the only reference to World War II in The Spider Woman, because by that time the war's focus was changing. But every time Holmes comes through, Watson gets distracted, and it gives Holmes enough time to break free. Outside of that really kind of silly ending, which is it's again an example of writing yourself into a corner. Milhouse's suggestion of using kind of horror theme element, and the thing is, the Spider-Woman is successful enough that Universal does a sequel, The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, which really has nothing to do with the earlier film, but it does have Gail Sandegard, and is trying to trade on the name of that. The next two films are very clearly in the horror film mode. The Scarlet Claw, the title alone is enough, and The Pearl of Death with Rondo Hatton, who was actually a literally deformed actor, playing this figure, the Creeper. And you read the description of the character in Doyle's own story, he fits the part perfectly. But when we get to that point, we are really and again, the Creeper goes on to appear in other films too. So there's a crossing over of the horror film genre and the detective film in the course of these films. But what is really happening is Holmes is being reclaimed as a more authentic Conan Doyle character rather than a William Gillette character. And by the same token, Watson is elevated to a role where he will never again be fourth or fifth billing in a Sherlock Holmes picture. He will always be right up there with the character playing Holmes. And whether that's Jude Law or James Mason or any number of other figures who have played the character of Watson. And it's interesting, Doyle in an interview shortly before he died does refer to Watson as Holmes's rather stupid friend. Now, Watson really only looks stupid compared to Holmes's genius, but obviously there's the attraction there of trying to carry out this comic element that gives Watson stature and character, and is it at its best is funny, and it does play the important part of giving that kind of a comedy relief. Toward the end, the Holmes features begin to run out. The stories get somewhat stale. Pursuit to Algiers, Dressed to Kill, but Rathbone and Bruce are a phenomenal team. It is tremendous. But Edward Hardwicke, I think of, plays with Jeremy Brett. Andre Morel, who was a first-rate character actor, plays with Peter Cushing. These are really effective, and they're not comic figures at all, but at least they're following in the wake of making Watson a much more central figure. And that's really kind of the way with the Hound of the Baskervilles, because Watson actually has much of the story to himself, while Holmes is allegedly back in London, and really he's hiding out on the moors. Okay, well, that's about enough for now. I really just want to make that the point, though, that once you get to 1939 and Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, the Holmes character and Holmes stories, Holmes's image, if you will, as a theatrical figure, as a dramatic figure, changes tremendously. Alice Faulkner is gone forever. She never comes back. Robert Downey Jr. does not have her holding her in his arms at the end of the Sherlock Holmes films in the 21st century. And the same way that Billy also drops out after the second Rathbone Bruce film. But in all of those, beginning with the film after The Hound of the Baskervilles, with The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, from that point on, it's Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes or whatever else. Who makes that decision to shift that is an interesting question. It doesn't seem to be Bertram Milhauser, because his earlier screenplay was very much along the Gillette lines. So my thought would be that it could well be Darryl F. Zanuck, who was the executive producer of those first two Holmes films, and he might have decided that Watson needed more attention, and you don't need the Holmes's love interest. It doesn't interfere with the character. just to mention in the film Dressed to Kill, the opening, Holmes does talk about Irene Adler, who is mentioned in the stories, and he calls her the woman. Now, Holmes devotees have conjured up all kinds of romantic ideas about Irene Adler and Holmes over the years, but there's none of that in the original Conan Doyle story. And in fact, Doyle makes very clear that Irene Adler is married, and then by the time the story in which she occurs, she's passed away. But nonetheless, you have that. That's the one moment where Holmes has some, at least, respect for the opposite sex. But again, so the limits are there. Holmes, once Rathbone is playing Holmes, Alice Faulkner is gone forever. And we do have the idea of putting Holmes in a horror setting. I would just close out by mentioning Murder by Decree, with Christopher Plummer as Holmes and James Mason as a wonderful Watson, again with some comic businesses. But that's a story about Jack the Ripper. And it's a horror film, no question about it. It's listed as one of the top horror films of the late 20th century. Bob Clark, who directed A Christmas Story, also directed Black Christmas, had his hand in some horror elements. And that idea had been done earlier in a film called A Study in Terror, where you've got Holmes going after Jack the Ripper. So the carryover, and certainly when you look at like the Hammer version of The Hound of the Baskervilles that we talked about earlier, it's clearly a horror film. So that overlap we can look to as, whereas the 1939 version of The Hound kind of qualifies that in a lot of ways, whereas the Hammer version goes fully after the whole idea of a horror theme. Okay, well, as I say, that's just some thoughts on how the Holmes character develops and why I think the Rathbone Bruce series is the best dramatizations of Sherlock Holmes. And we'll no doubt refer to some of these again, because Universal was the fountainhead out of which all of this came in the 1930s and 40s. But that's enough for now. This is Paul saying goodbye, and we'll see you again on 10 Times the Terror.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 Times the Terror,
the podcast.
One of my favorite films ever. Let's do that one again. Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.